So, what's up, everybody? This is our fourth entry in the Infrared Show, and we have another special guest this time coming from Burkina Faso.
Word. Hey, I'm sorry, I didn't know it was my cue. So yeah, it's Ankh, and I'm an instructional designer, Pan-Africanist, writer, teacher. In currently born in America, currently residing in Burkina Faso.
Yeah,
So,
and I think one of the reasons we wanted to have you on is because I think the kind of questions around Pan Africanism and in general, if you want to use the world, this kind of shift, I think, of the world spirit, the Geist, to Africa, which has been
word.
going on from the 21st century on, I think has been really neglected and underlooked by the Western left, and even just in general, the kind of uh, way of thinking of leftists, even globally. And I think there's a lot of lessons and insights that are to be learned from it that apply to everybody and are relevant to everybody.
I would agree with you. I would agree with you that it's a movement that is, well, you could say it's always kind of been there, but it's just an undercurrent that is just now seems to be gaining more momentum. Definitely not as much as people in the movement, or like myself, or I would say Evan as well. I don't want to speak for you, but to a certain degree, um, would not as much as we would like, but it's considerable.
Yeah, I mean, I myself am not too versed on the entire history of Pan Africanism or the current trends in the movement, but I'm very interested about. Uh, I'm very interested in. So, would you say that as a vision for as this kind of almost, it's also a geopolitical, it's a national. There's all sorts of different facets to the vision. What do you think as far as in terms of right now in 2020? Where do you think you see the site of, so to speak, Pan Africanism unfolding the most right now?
Um, Hard to say, but I would say that generally speaking, the base of Pan Africanism is really, uh, ironically, not in Africa. It is mostly in the West, United States. The diaspora does have a reputation of recognizing the movement and its strengths, weaknesses, more so than Africans within the continent. Ironically, that is in fact the case. In 2020, I have to say, although in 2020 a lot of things have been unmasked, I feel like in the different conditions of Africans all over the world, it's being brought to bear. But I also believe that it's not like people didn't know these things. And generally speaking, in the movement itself, we are still waiting for a central leadership. And I think that's the biggest issue with Pan Africanism as a whole, is that it has no base, has no power structure that you can say, well, this institution stands for Pan Africanism. This institution will be able to fund this initiative behind Pan Africanism. There is no such institution. So, although we've been out and about since, I could say, the time of Marcus Garvey, which is early 1900s. Um, it has not it has not materialized as of yet. As of yet.
Yeah, and what you mentioned about the central role of the diaspora, it makes a lot of sense. Beginning from the anti-colonial struggles, they were led by people who were exposed to the kind of outside world, outside of where they were from, first, even across the board. But also, it also makes a kind of intuitive sense, that the people who have been removed from the homeland or the motherland, so to speak,
Yeah.
only then are they able to bear witness to this kind of Africa as a whole, right? Rather than be bogged down by the kind of narrow view that are of the parochial and particular
Exactly.
circumstances.
Exactly.
Right. And I would say it corresponds as well to Sankofa, or this process of re-Africanization. So those within the diaspora reconnecting with their African heritage. We see a correspondence between the movement for Sankofa, or the Sankofa movement, this process of re-Africanization, and then Pan-Africanism.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting insights of what I call materialist dialectic, so to speak, is that the moment in which something appears purely negative, groundless, devoid of base and substance, which one can argue at face value would be the African diaspora, right? Taken and removed from the homeland. One of the insights of the dialectic is that the moment of the negativity is merely the process by which the ground or the concrete, at its more fundamental level, is able to be revealed. In other words, it may appear that there's just this negativity, there's just this absence, but this is merely a part of a deeper reconciliation. If that makes sense.
I think I can catch your drift in terms of I mean to be cliche, but there is a saying that the revolution will not be televised, in the sense that there is that change that will take place, but it won't exactly be visual. It'll be subtle, and I definitely agree with you that that's. It doesn't mean that it's not existent, but definitely without an institution, it is hard for us to get any gains. It's hard for us to get any gains.
Yeah, the question of the institution you bring up is really interesting because in this age in which we're witnessing a shift from the Western or Eurocentric oriented manner of, let's say, the relation between nations and institutions, which is the traditional nation state, to this kind of more, I would argue, for now, Asian type of statehood, which is transnational and it's more abstract, the institution, so to speak. For example, whether it's a communist party or some kind of higher apparatus, it's something almost beyond institution, but also which is able to ground a kind of network of institutions.
It's interesting that you attribute that to the Asian, to the East, rather than the West. You would say that you think that they are the ones who kind of fronted that movement, or would you say? I mean, because the wave of globalization seems to have been something that was just the natural evolution of capitalism, as it were.
Oh yeah, well, the question of the origination is difficult. I think in terms of because the way I think, which is a kind of the dialectic thinking, is that something may originate in the West, let's say global capitalism and so on, but it only originates there in order to reveal something about somewhere else. If that makes sense. Which is to say, I think the trend of the late 20th century, it's difficult to say whether Asia has led the way, or Africa, or Latin America, and so on. I tend not to even really think in those terms. I just think in terms of they represent new kinds of orientations and forms of statehood. And I only mentioned Asia because right now, at this kind of decisive moment, there's a clear struggle between the American imperialism and countries like China and Russia and so on and so on. But yes, I think it's interesting What do you perceive as mainly the main obstacles to this kind of institution building that is from a kind of Pan-African perspective? Because although I don't know much about the situation, I think I've perceived, especially in South Africa, instances of this new rise of xenophobia and anti-migrant stuff that is mirroring almost what's going on in Europe.
Yes, it is. I would say I'll start off with the problems. I'll start off with the internal, and then I will go into the external. Um, Internally, the biggest obstacle to Pan Africanism is, in fact, the concept in itself. Pan Africanism is a bit crazy if you think about it, because it doesn't exist anywhere else. If there is no such thing as, how do you say, Pan Europeanism or Pan Asianism. It doesn't exist in that form exactly. You can say maybe white supremacy or different supremacies that may exist, but there is no idea that okay, everyone that looks like this certain race is going to be on the same page about this, and that. It's not stated. There may be something like that, but I've certainly never seen it in the purest sense. The European Union tried to exemplify that in several unions, but you see how fickle they are when times get hard. They start to pull apart. So I
Yeah,
think
with the coronavirus in particular.
exactly. So you've seen it. It's possible, and I want to shout out to my friend there in Germany. Just a young shout out. You guys are going to be the next bosses. Looks like just geopolitical prediction. We can make that later, but hey, I see you. Um, but yes, and what I'm trying to say is that that would be the concept in itself is it's a big mission. Now, if we get back into the internal issues, I would say that um, the disunity that is inherent in Africa's history is a big issue. If you look at the history of Africa going back to prehistoric times up until now, there are not too many empires that were able to unite big swaths of the continent. So you have a division that has always been there. And Africa is quite huge, has diverse landscapes and uh, most genetically diverse place on the planet. There's a lot of differences there, and not a lot of people actually. It has never been attempted to unify all of them under one identity. You have your Mali empires, the empire of Egypt, or Kemet as it was known at the time, and you have different empires, but none were able to unify, give that one identity based on race. There's always citizenship of a country or a state or an empire, never fixation on race in itself. So there you have it. Although you have a somehow um, similar cultural tendencies, you have an issue then with the identity. So it's never been there. And as I said, the first Pan-Africanist in concept who was ever actually able to put it in words was not even in Africa. So that's your first issue. That we're talking about Pan-Africanism, and the biggest issue in Africa is the fact that Africans are not united in one mind, even though culturally they are. So I think that is the biggest issue. If you see historically, that has always been the issue. Whereas others are able to either move in a way that is not detrimental to the base. Africans can often be caught in that because of the lack of the disunity. So I think that is one of our internal ones, just to wrap it up. Now, externally, Africa is a bit of it's a bit of a, how do I say, our resources. You can't see a continent like Africa and then not think that you want something from it. So that disunity, when you see it, I don't really, and it's funny because I don't really put any malice or anything in the minds of those who take advantage of weaknesses, but I just feel like in a capitalist system, that is what you do. You see a weakness, you exploit it, you get the resources that you need, and that's what it is. Like they say, the winners don't really have morals. Morals are for people who are not on the winning side. So that's really what it is. That's just the the external forces. So I would say that that's basically the two big issues. It's lack of unity, and externally, what I think counts more is that lack of unity than the obvious um, capitalist response to such a weakness.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that had brought me an interest to various, not simply to Pan Africanism, the word is kind of a catch-all, but to this unique circumstances you find in Africa as opposed to elsewhere, was I was writing and dwelling and researching this basic, what is the national question in the 21st century? The framework of the national question, principally as formulated by Marxists in the early 20th century, is clearly no longer sufficient in order to capture, because Africa is probably the best example. Here you have what are apparently national, or at least proto-national. It's a word I use a lot. Tribal and all these sorts of kinds of differences, which cannot be neatly delimited or demarcated as separate nations, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But in studying, for example, Europe, it's an interesting case even in Europe. How did Germany become a nation? How did France become a nation? These weren't always united nations. It was, so, but then I came to the conclusion that it's a tricky question as far as even the word Africa is a little bit misleading, right? Because, like you said, it's so diverse. There's so many different regions and cultures. But I think what unites, I think the thrust of Pan-Africanism and why the concept it's able to have this kind of conceptual coherence it's not because of what Africans share positively. It's simply what they share negatively. It's what they share as a common existential and world historical predicament in relation to the vestiges of colonialism and more fundamentally what we kind of call modernity. It's a common predicament which can be defined negatively. And my hypothesis is that the point of these kinds of broad movements, such as Pan-Africanism, is not so much to erase this wealth of difference, but almost to establish this common recognition of this common predicament, only so in order that these differences can actually develop and flourish on their own terms, similar to Europe.
We appreciate it.
Definitely. Evan, you want to step in?
Oh, no. Just yeah. The sort of subsuming an identity for the larger whole. But on the issue, you had spoken on the issue of an identity crisis, and it made me think of the achievements or the work of Diop that Diop was doing, and his work more broadly for the Pan-African movement. Him trying to assert a unifying element through culture. That was like his long-standing project. And so I was interested if you wanted to speak at all on the achievements of Diop and Obenga, particularly in reference to like the UNESCO debate.
Symposium.
So on and so forth. So I guess to give some background information, because of the identity crisis that Africans at home and abroad face, there have been scholars, scientists who try to assert some form of unifying characteristic. Cheikh Anta Diop went on this mission looking for linguistic and other cultural unifying characteristics of Black Africa. And so if you wanted to carry on from there.
Well, okay, yeah. Just piggyback on that. I guess just to set the stage, I think essentially what Diop was, he was a scholar who was an activist, a physician, a historian. He did a lot of research just to actually connect the cultural trends within Africa because the disunity especially affected the education of Africans, and the conquer and destroy tactic takes on multiple forms, of course, even in the educational system. And so Africans would be next to each other and then not realize that they do in fact have a likeness of sorts. So this research that he did, I'm going to try and sum it up. He's done a lot, but essentially he started off with proving that Africa was the birthplace of mankind. He analyzed findings by Petrie in the Great Lakes region. And one of his most controversial statements, or one of his more controversial findings, was that the Egyptian civilization, as it was known, was an African civilization, not only culturally, but racially. How did he prove this? Well, he did a melanin dosage test. He was able to actually get melanin off of mummies and count the amount of melanin and find that that amount of melanin can only be found in someone that is of the Negro type. Of course, the matter of skin color is always controversial. People say, oh, the Egyptians are black. It's true that the skin color in itself does not say, well, this person is black, because you have dark-skinned Asians, you have dark-skinned Indians. But if you find a dark-skinned person in Africa, I mean, what are we really saying? So that proximity there, he found intellectuals that quoted and gave descriptions. And I think the part of that was the part of his thesis that was undebatable. Essentially, all those other points I just stated, scholars disagreed but could not disprove. At this symposium in 1974, he stood there at the UNESCO symposium and he debated with other Egyptologists. And although they did not agree, they could not disprove it. And the one point that they left valid was the linguistic links between Egypt, the Egyptian language, Medunter, and West African language known as Wolof. The linguistic links between them were seen to be at the 80% rate, meaning that 80% of the words actually corresponded, had the same meaning, tone, and sound in some cases. And so,
does it reflect even today, or was it just back in the day, like thousands of years ago?
That is today.
Okay.
They were looking at Kemet Medunter as it was, Middle Kingdom onwards, and then they looked at Wolof as it is spoken today. And
I see.
Find these similarities in the
language. Wolof, is that it sounds familiar? Is this categorized as an Afro-Asiatic language?
It is language of West Africa, Senegal.
Yeah, because it's interesting. I've my limited knowledge on the question. The so-called Afro-Asiatic language family extends as far as West Africa, to Chad and so on and so on, and so and very diverse groups, which I'm doubtful were just the result of foreign influence.
It definitely, the question of the Afro-Asiatic is also it is a question that always comes up, and indeed I think is one of the points where I think Diop and I and some other scholars would disagree, where he would say that, well, Egypt was a majority, was completely black. And I don't believe at any point the Egyptian civilization was completely black. But I believe that during the foundation, the prehistoric period, and the Old Kingdom, up until the Middle Kingdom, the majority of the population, so that is from Upper Egypt, leading all the way up to the Delta region, was a majority Negroid space. And that was so culturally as well as racially. After the Middle Kingdom, the Hyksos invade, they occupy for 100 years. That changes the genetic map of Egypt forever, essentially. But still, they maintain that majority in terms of the leadership far into the late period. But yes, I would say Afro-Asiatic, although it is a term that I agree with in terms of the influence, I think that the Asiatic aspect does not really take too much hold until after the Middle Kingdom. So the language of Wolof, being a kingdom, being a language that essentially lived before and after the Asiatic invasion of North Africa, I think is a bit exempt from that particular group. Although in West Africa, you will find languages that have that influence because of course, later invasions of North Africa by Arabs.
Yeah, I mean, I just mean to say, no, I agree, and that's why I think the term is kind of the fact that there needs to be such a term is what I find interesting, because you see that from India to Europe, through Persia and Europe, there's a common language family that's called the Indo-European language family.
Yes.
So Semitic, which is a branch of supposedly, I don't know if you may disagree with the term Afro-Asiatic, it begs the question, where's that coming from, you know? Because it's not, so it opens the door to the question of, does this language family originate in Africa? And I think it's an open question.
Indeed. I am not going to say I'm too versed on the origins of that particular language, but what I doing the research, in the debate, in fact, it actually came up where they were comparing the quote unquote Semitic languages to the Egyptian languages, and they were not able to find as many links as would be perceived. Because when you think of Egypt, you think that it would have a lot of links with the Semitic people, but in fact, it does not. Which drives me to the last point, which was the cultural aspect of Egypt, which is to me really the most convincing, despite the more concrete scientific and linguistic proofs. Just the culture of the Egyptian people, I think, is where it comes up first. You have circumcision, you have the matrilineal organization of the state, which is pretty common in Africa. It only changes as people move, and of course, as people move, the woman has less value because she's essentially more baggage if you're moving. So then they may settle, and then the system may change to a patriarchal or a patrilineal one because of that move. But if you're staying in one spot, then the female can pretty much be allowed to have a power position. So that is what is evident in a lot of African societies, and Egypt is not exempt from that. As well as other different things, like as far as even the headrest. I don't know if it's something that if you can Google, it's this little thing that they put under the neck, and then you're supposed to sleep on it. The idea is to preserve your hairstyle for the next day, which is something that is not found in the Near East. It is only found in the Far East, so in China, around that region, that's where you find headrests. You don't find them necessarily in the Middle East. You don't really find them too much in Europe. It is in the interior of Africa, Egypt, and Far East Asia. So it's one of those things. This the culturally, the people were at the UNESCO debate that they were able to, they were forced to admit that culturally, Egypt is a black civilization. And Sheikh Anta Diop and Teofilo Benga were the driving forces. They were, in fact, it was 3 against 7. And
they shut it down.
Yeah, it was quite. It's just a shame that people don't know much about this, and I've shared a paper with Evan that actually it's a transcript of the entire debate, and it's what the conclusion is really strange. The way it concluded essentially was that they admitted, scholars that were present admitted that linguistically and culturally, Egypt was an African nation. But they said on the other points mentioned, essentially Diop and Teofilo Benga were so prepared that they did not expect to get this kind of have this kind of research, have this kind of information in front of them, and so they were not prepared for the debate, which is weird to me. I don't know if you show up to a debate and you don't have all the things, that you just take the L. You lost the debate. But they said, well, we couldn't disprove you, but we don't agree with you. And I guess that's just the intellectual space for me.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think that definitely we're coming from is that there's this blind trust in institutional, in the West, I mean, legitimacy and credibility and all this kind of stuff. And you have to really be coming from a more foreign perspective. I think it's the worst in America, probably, to be able to see that the experts and these institutions and all the kinds of epistemologies and knowledge and also forms of knowledge I just mentioned, they're not sent down from heaven, so to speak. There's inertia, right? The institutional paradigms of the West, you can see that they're stagnating. They're destined for collapse. So I'm always open and interested to rivaling and heterodox and opposing and challenging kinds of theories, be it in the sphere of history, as you described, but also in science and all kinds of things. I'm always open to hearing these kinds of things because I don't possess this blind. From experience, I have to learn the hard way. I don't possess this trust in the mere inertia of institutions and the stamp of credibility and legitimacy. And segueing into a relevant topic on that note, one of the things, the backgrounds I'm coming from of interest theoretically is also, in addition to Marxism and so on, is also psychoanalysis. And one of the things that have brought me again, I hate simply saying the continent because it's not particular, but brought me to the sphere of Africa in terms of finding interest in various movements and so on and so on, is that it seems to me that on this question of not only institution building, but also party building, right, organization building, that this sphere of the ideological, the psychological, and so on, take an unprecedented role in terms of their importance. I've noticed that in various diverse Pan-African approaches and ways of thinking, and also from decolonial theory and so on, a lot of it is about this newfound proximity to being able to psychologically see past obstacles and limits and so on and so on. In other words, it's psychological and this question of the unconscious and so on, especially from Fanon himself, who was himself a psychoanalyst from Algeria. Yes. This question of seeing this as a site of political and social significance, I think more than anywhere else in Africa has taken on this significance. And that's why for me, as someone who's not really even coming from, so to speak, a Pan-African perspective in the beginning, but coming from a perspective of psychoanalysis and Marxism and so on, it happened that looking into Africa, the site of Pan-Africanism and so on, I inadvertently discovered a lot of strange, almost as the concrete manifestation of what I was theorizing, if that makes sense.
Okay, in what sense? In terms of when you say what you were theorizing?
Well, from this broad attempt to link psychoanalysis with Marxism, and then also ontology and so on and so on.
Okay.
one of the fundamental questions for me is this question of this new significance of this issue of class consciousness, right? How is it that something like class consciousness is able to emerge? Because in the past, you simply had a readily made formation, the workers' movement and the industrial working class, and all you had to do was kind of intervene at that site. But now, as far as the question of Marxism is concerned, you have this newfound significance of the ideological and the psychological. So you have to theorize this in order to to still be a materialist in a sense, right?
I understand.
From a classical materialist perspective, these sphere of psychological and ideological and so on and so on is not supposed to have so much significance. So the whole meaning of dialectic materialism, historical materialism, all of that has to be reevaluated and looked at once again.
I definitely agree with you. I must say that in the African context, what I've found recently, which is very interesting, is that the African continent in its state structure is not monogamous in the sense that it is not all same, homogeneous, I'm sorry, in the sense that it is not all the same, because there are certain states in Africa you'll find historically that do not have a caste system.
You said caste system?
Yes. Do not have that breakdown in the social structure that is purely linked to materials. And so it lends for an interesting study of, like, as you say, psychoanalysis. And where I go with that is essentially trying to understand how is it that Africa would find itself in this situation, in this particular situation. And when I go into the psychosis, now I have to warn everyone, the territory we're going in is very much hypothesis. So I've made some research on this, but it is very, very
experimental, right?
Yes, very experimental. You look at the movements. You look at Africa as a continent, as a whole. We spoke about the size, the general scope of it. Historically, you study the movements of different peoples. It's mostly linked to conflict, or if the first factor, of course, is the natural disasters such as desertification that can occur. Second is conflict. Africa has this space that lends itself, like any space, to fight or flight. The size of it pushes the possibility of flight to a higher degree because there's space. If a force comes in with superior military technology and they are able to displace you, you move to another place. Because there is that possibility in Africa. It's just that big. A lot of it was mostly jungle in terms of the central region. And the central region was mostly jungle, so when people were beaten, they moved into that jungle with their superior technology, and they were able to create themselves a new kingdom there. And that would happen from time to time. After the fall of Egypt, it became more and more apparent that these things could happen, and they did happen. And what you find there is, in fact, that because of that, the mentality is different. And that's why people always ask themselves, okay, what's up with African military technology? Why didn't it evolve? Why didn't it get to the point where it was like, I don't know, Europe or Far East Asia? And I always tell people to think about this. If you look at the territory that Genghis Khan was able to conquer, and you look at the Mongolians, they were able to conquer Eurasia, essentially. And during that whole period, so the Mongolian rule of that region, Mansa Musa in Africa was able to be the richest man in the world. And let me tell you, the military technology was no match. They were using cannons and siege warfare in Mongolia. In Africa, siege warfare is not on the level at all. But yet we have Mansa Musa, who is the richest man on the planet. So that should tell you already just the disparity, because you have this super powerful military nation, but the richest man on the planet is in Africa, and his military is negligible compared to Mongolian. And I've done this, I'm telling you, man, as someone who loves military history, I've studied it and I've tried to find ways, or maybe it's this, maybe it's that. It's just not okay. If you want to get into hypothetical, maybe if Mongolians and the Malian warriors went on the battlefield, it depends where it was. Maybe they could secure a victory. But I'm just looking at purely statistics and what is on hand, what we know that both sides had as weapons. Mongolians were far superior. So that gives you an idea that the riches in Africa and the space in Africa affected psychologically the mind of Africans in the sense of their ability to respond to conflict and their focus on conflict. Because when you have a system like that, where your military is not being challenged to that extent, you have more time to focus on other things such as institutions, your laws, your morality. You can really ponder on those topics a whole lot longer because you're not focused on advancing military technology. So those efforts that went in different regions towards that are redirected into different areas of society. So that's where you see that, and that's why I think I circle back to your idea of psychoanalysis, because I am really interested in studying the effect that had in the way that colonialism was able to take hold of this continent. Because I want to see essentially how that is linked to it. And I know that there are, what do we call them? I'm forgetting the word now. Determinism. It is, what is it called again? Where they
environmental determinism.
Environmental determinism. I agree with them to a certain degree. I just don't get to the same conclusions as them, I would say. Because a large majority of them would use that argument that I just gave you to say, oh, well, that's because Africans are lazy and they stay in the sun, and fries the brain, and so on and so forth. They get to these ridiculous conclusions. But I'm just saying that I would be interesting to really study that, look at the different cultures and see, okay, in this culture, that movement, when you move like that, you essentially lose things. And so how did that affect the psychology of the African? So I think I definitely agree with you that psychoanalysis is something that definitely needs to be studied and needs to be pushed to the forefront, especially in Pan-Africanism, when we think of how to find a solution to these problems that we face. As you said, I would say that I would agree with you that Pan-Africanism is very much a response to an existential threat as opposed to a thought that just came out of our quote-unquote life or daily, day-to-day interaction.
You know, it's very interesting you bring up this point of the exit stuff. You know, this external threat, as you put it, that I identify is really not simply only European colonialism, but it's modernity as such. It's modernity, what they call the catastrophe of modernity, which even in Europe, right, you had the traditional realities of Europe. Even these were swept away and overturned, right? All over the world, how should we say, the blight of modernity has posed a challenge for every type of people in relation to the past. And on that same point, see, for me, the dialectic perspective on this question of modernity and the whole history since, let's say, whenever the Protestant Reformation or something, is this irony of the relation between the modern, the present, and the past. So within this scheme of a linear historical chronologization, right? Um, the prejudice is that Africa is merely lesser advanced. And before Africa is Asia was lesser advanced. And before Asia,
Yeah,
Russia was lesser advanced. Before
exactly.
Asia, Germany was lesser advanced. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
But the
yeah.
irony of modernity has always been that what is perceived as the less advanced vestige of the past, and in this African context, would be the lesser developed forms of conflict and warfare, the lesser developed social formations, and so on and so on, actually represent a fundamental aspect of being that has merely been forgotten and neglected after this singularity we call modernity. And a very concrete example of this, as which you mentioned, which is very interesting, is how today, right now in 2020, let's say the 21st century as such, you have this new question of the relation between state and civil society, right? And many admittedly reactionary theorists, but also futuristic type of theorists, with this new significance of Singapore, private governance, private cities, and also smart cities in general, the view of merely one universal polity, right, is diminishing. And what is entering in the horizon really is this treating of spaces, specifically city-states, polities, as almost places not which you dwell in as your eternal home, but as places which you dwell in as a kind of almost kind of choice, where that if you have a problem, right, you just leave and go to another, almost like a market. You know what I mean? And what you mentioned about Africa is very interesting, because I think it's so ironic, because these theorists of the private governance, they tend to be reactionaries who subscribe to ridiculous pseudoscientific racialistic kind of views toward Africans, and yet the apogee of the concrete realization of what they see as the future is, I think, going to be realized in Africa. I think Africa will be the site of, let's say, where 1,000 Singapores will bloom, so to speak.
I think you may be right about that. I think 1,000 Chinese colonies are going to boom before that, but yeah, eventually, eventually, an African state of that sort would do. And I think I even discussed that with Ethan at one point, where I was telling him that this Pan-Africanism concept will probably just start off as one country that is just really well off and that is practicing it in itself, and then go on from there. So I think, yeah, privatization is definitely the way forward. I would say the way forward.
Yeah, I mean, already there are cities that are being planned in Nigeria, I believe in Senegal. And these cities are, there, of course, Chinese-led investment initiatives and so on, but this is part of the dialectic of history, right? I don't think it means Africa will be devoured by China. I think China is inadvertently laying the basis for this rise of Africa, inadvertently, in a way that it's not prepared for or planning for, but which will inevitably be an irony of history, so to speak. But
that's a very optimistic view to hear. I have to say, man, that's really.
In the last instance, my view is always optimistic, so to speak. Right? But one man's optimism is also another man's pessimism, right?
Indeed.
But yes, the African view toward this question of polity, which also comes to this conflict, civil war, and so on, is different from the West and maybe the rest of the world. But the arrogant assumption that this is merely a backward leftover of the past, I think, as we see in America and as we see in Europe and the rest of the world, whoever subscribes to this view will eat their words, because in fact it's a challenge Africa is posing internally for the rest of the world. Africa merely reveals an aspect about all of us we just forgot about. but which is becoming increasingly relevant, especially in the U.S., which, as you know, is the big headline in the U.S. is this irresolvable deadlock of political conflict.
I would agree with you there. I would see that in America's case, I think it's just a case of words, dogma, essentially being defiled by reality on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
It's just constant. It's just every day, and it's more apparent on the internet, I would say, than probably the media there. But it's just, and it's really Americans. What the biggest struggle that Americans have are, in fact, Americans and their own mentality and being able to deal with the fact that everything that they were told, most of it, in some way, shape, or form, is a lie, which is not unique in the sense that all the states tend to be formed on a little bit of lies and mixed truths, but Americans they are so high off the American dream. It's crazy.
Yeah, sorry, I don't. Yeah, I look at the index, like I said in an earlier video, by which I interpret recent events, is this self-implosion and psychosis and degradation and decadence of America. It's like a dramatic kind of fall of Rome or Babylon that's going on.
And Trump looks like Nero, man. It's just
yeah. Yeah.
Like the guy's just laughing through it and all.
But also another big site of critique for us is, in addition to Trump, it's mainly the white left in America. The supposedly radical left in the U.S. It's also, we also see this as also a symptom of the decadence and the degeneration, so to speak, of the empire.
I wonder, have you had any experience, or if there's anyone in the chat who has come into contact? I talked to Evan about this with, I said an anarchist, but actually when I watched this video again, he is actually a libertarian. And their views, I've used, I don't know if anyone has ever delved into that or haven't spoken to anyone with that particular political point of view, but just their approach to this situation, one person in particular was very interesting to me, because essentially in response to all these Black Lives Matter protests and calls to defund the police, one particular libertarian said that, well, I don't agree with you guys only because what you're talking about is still part of what I am not agreeing with, in the sense that you still represent the state. And the state, for me, represents oppression. So I wanted to know if anyone has ever dealt with that, or how they feel like how that fits into.
Well, I think we've discussed these kinds of things extensively with anarchism and libertarianism. The way I view it is, I view it as a kind of distraction. I view it as a distraction because I think, and especially this is relevant toward the question of Africa, I think these types of anarchists or libertarians, I think they impose an impossible litmus test. For example, I think there's a call in Black communities in the U.S. for self-community policing, right? They want to be able to have control over their own communities.
Of course, self-determination and autonomy.
Yeah, and then, but anarchists, yeah, I promise that's not a Freudian slip. But anarchists, because they all mostly tend to be white, right? In the U.S., they will come and they will say, no, this is still not good enough. It's evil, right? And then, but specifically on the question of Africa, we've discussed this a lot. I kind of wanted to get into the economy stuff a little bit later, but this is a good time to bring it up. I think I don't see how African peoples can have a future if they don't, and they do, obviously they do, have some kind of ambition to develop themselves, industrialize themselves, right? Acquire independent economic basis. But yes, then the anarchists in America and so on will say, no, you can't do this, right? You should you should leave it so that Africa is just beautiful landscapes with all these kind of animals, and people still maybe can't feed themselves, have shelter. We don't care. We'll give them charity and feel good about ourselves. You know what I mean by this, or?
Yes, it's yeah. Essentially, I don't think that's something that fits with our context. There are a lot of things. Democracy in itself is something that is democracy as it is sold in the Western world in itself also does not apply very easily to the African continent. So yes, I would agree with you on that point. What I would say is that definitely to agree with you in terms of economic institutions, that is definitely a point where Africans have to manage to get on the same page. And I think that's the point where I think China's presence may be able to facilitate that because of their style of colonization. I just call a spade a spade. Their style of colonization may be more conducive to that, as long as they're able to get a cut. I feel that they would be fine. But yeah, that is something that is left to be determined by by who will be the winner of this conflict that is currently taking place.
Yeah, I mean, one of the I've heard arguments from Africans about China, which is that China is essentially economically colonizing Africa. There's no way to beat around that bush. But at the same time, it's not a political colonization, right? They're not coming with armies and invading people and imposing their order on people. So that gives Africans a much better place to start, so to speak, than what they call the Washington Consensus, which is direct, coercive, political.
Definitely, and psychologically as well, Africans are spared because there's no such thing as Chinese Jesus. So there's no way to get in there because that's also a big issue.
Right. So, yeah. The Chinese don't seem to be interested in controlling Africans. They're very pragmatic about their aims. They want African resources, and in exchange, they're willing to help build infrastructure.
Exactly.
And in this case, I think Ethiopia is a really interesting example because I think this is where China is most present in Africa. And it's also giving rise to an interesting kind of symbiosis, right? Ethiopia has not only has it a growing tech culture from African startups, but what they're looking at specifically as what solutions to what problems they're looking at, I think in a sense is almost more advanced than currently in the West in terms of how they perceive, sorry, I kind of rambling right now. A concrete example of this, I think, would be this: how to not distribute, sell, because this is economics, right? Affordable cell phones, right? This was a thing earlier before the internet stuff, and now smartphones and so on and so on. Another thing about this kind of topic of what I call, or what someone else has called, that I'm borrowing, archaeo-modernism, right? China doesn't have any, what are they called? For telephones, the wires, what are they called? You know what I'm talking about? Like, so stupid, I'm sorry. Like in the US and Europe, they have these
telephone wires.
Right? What are they called? Telephone wires?
Telephone wires.
Yeah, that's it?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, China has none of those, right? Because China immediately jumped to cell phones. So these kinds of leaps are taking place in Africa right now, not only in terms of infrastructure, concrete infrastructure, but also maybe paradigms of technology. The biggest example of this, and I don't know if this is the best time to plug this in, is how do Africans buy and sell things in many African countries? It's through their smartphones. And this is the projected future for America. Facebook wants to do what is already commonplace in Africa. Small vendors selling through apps like Facebook. The thing I wanted to get into was cryptocurrency, because I think that is also the central site of this new currency war that will be waged between the U.S. and China, or crypto war, if you will, is, I think, going to be Africa, primarily Africa. But the currency, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. The currency question, I think we can really get a lot out of here, because we can talk about the Gaddafi plan of the gold dinars, right? We can talk about the CFA franc in West Africa. So currency politics, I think, has a huge and monumental significance for the African continent. But go on. Sorry.
I essentially was going to back you up in terms of that. I will start with the CFA Francais that we have here in West and Central Africa. It is essentially, it is the most parasitic form of a currency I've ever seen before. It is essentially, think of France as just a giant vampire lord, and he's just sucking the blood out of these West and Central African countries, and that is really what they've done. And again, you'll find that it is not something that is irrefutable or invincible in any sense, because North African countries were able to rid themselves of that. Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, all of them, as soon as they got independence, the first thing they did was question the currency and actually rid themselves of it. All of them former French colonies. Madagascar as well. This one I just recently found out, it shocked me. 1972, they said bye-bye to the CFA. And they actually took the time to go through they had a transitional moment before they got to the area, which is what they are using today. So it is definitely a journey, a step that Africans will have to take in heading into the future. But I think that the out that cryptocurrency gives us is the fact that we can head into cryptocurrency quicker with our technology base that is already quite considerable at this time. Cryptocurrency just seems like the logical next step. If we start to invest in that, because really, if we invest in cryptocurrency, there's no way for them to really stop us. Gaddafi is one example of him trying to play the game according to their rules, and them just essentially just swiping the chessboard off the table, sticking a gun in your face, like, okay, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, the French president said that before Gaddafi's collapse, and I'm not a huge Gaddafi fan, but he said that Gaddafi's proposal for the gold dinar was an existential threat to the financial security of mankind.
Man, French kind, more likely.
Exactly, yeah. That's all humankind, you know. Yeah. Sorry, yeah,
I think, yeah, I'd be interested to know exactly, because my biggest question with cryptocurrency, and I have to say I'm not as versed on it. I've just really, really peeked into it, and really it requires a high IT knowledge to get into, from what I hear, from what I've seen. And I think that Africans are good for that. It's not exactly a conflict there, but what would you say is the point where Africans can really take the cryptocurrency to the next level? What would you say, besides the technological base, gives us the possibility to do that?
Well, I think the big story of crypto and blockchain, is what they call them, blockchain currencies, is this decline of gold as the basis of currency. So currency, since the end of the gold standard, had become political, so to speak, especially with the rise of the petrodollar, the arrangement by which oil can only be sold in dollars. And also when Saddam started to sell them in euros, that's when, he got overthrown. So this is a story that has been a long time in the making, so to speak. So with this decline of a objective, so to speak, non-political currency, there's a niche that was always in need of being filled, and for very practical, even I think pragmatic reasons. Um, it is not efficient, for example, for migrants traveling across different countries with different currencies and different denominations to work, right? And then they have to go through a lot um, of bullshit, basically, to be able to send the money back home in the correct currency. There's all these kinds of hurdles faced by people, and big tech sees this as a big niche to plug in their platforms, like Facebook. Facebook had the Libra proposal to get more people using their platforms. There's that, but then there's also the political and financial instability that has come with the fiat currencies, right? There's the fact that currency politics plays a big role in the various disparities between, as far as trade is concerned, between nations. The CPA franc is an example we mentioned of more explicit, but even when it's not so explicit, this problem of fiat currency also enables and helps to give rise to neo-colonial forms of domination. So I think the big appeal of cryptocurrency is, first of all, it's less, but also more, in a sense, political. Less political in the sense that it gives some kind of measure to an objective form of value, price, that cannot simply be manipulated. Cryptocurrency, the whole point of blockchain is basically that it's based on consensus. Actually, you really don't ever own the coins, those blockchain currency coins. What you own is a ledger which says you have so and so amount of coins.
Okay.
And this ledger, in order to be connected to the network, the blockchain network, has to be validated by confirming every other transaction that came before it. If that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah.
So your ledger, so to speak, contains every single transaction that came before it, and that the sum total of this takes the form of a special. I'm botching it a lot. I'm really botching it a lot, but it takes the form of a Raul knows more. What is it called? What is this special code that you need to decipher? What is it called?
Oh, it's like a product of prime numbers.
The what?
A product of prime numbers, of two big prime numbers.
No, but
and you need to find them.
There's a word. It's a cipher. I'm so stupid. I can't believe it. It's a it's a cryptographic key or something they call it, right?
Yeah,
It's
they
like
use that
that.
to encrypt.
Yeah, and the sum total. This I'm describing Bitcoin right now. The sum total of all the computers that are on this network need to use their computational power in order to decipher this key. So the network. Sorry, I'm kind of rambling on at this point. The main point for I think the African context is that it's a currency which is similar to gold in the sense that it cannot be subject to political manipulation that fiat is, but also it is also more political in a sense because crypto needs to be on a certain platform. Certain kinds of crypto need to be used, and which ones will be used, I think, is the site of the political aspect. But insofar as crypto is used, they can't be manipulated in the same way fiat is. So
right, and that's one of the reasons that many countries in Africa, due to currency manipulation, that's the reason that they've turned largely to Bitcoin. But of course, other forms of cryptocurrency. But Bitcoin is by and large what is being invested in and traded.
Yeah, but China's central bank just came out with their own. I don't know what it's called, but their own thing, and then the U.S. in response is going to want to allow Facebook, Libra, to do their own.
Now, something interesting too. I don't know if anybody's paid attention to this, but Americans in particular, tying it back to, I guess, private cities as well as, laying the foundation. I don't think we should disregard or, take for granted those Africans in America repatriating and the influence that they'll have on the African Renaissance. For example, in Senegal, we had the rapper Akon, right? Akon is repatriated back to Senegal and now going back to the private cities, is establishing his own city, Akon City. And in that city, he will be establishing what's called the A coin. And then it's a complete cryptocurrency based economy. So something interesting to pay attention to. Wow. But again, yes, we can't take for granted those Africans throughout the diaspora who choose and are welcome to repatriate the continent, how they will influence the rise of Africa.
And indeed, I think it's as you said, all it takes is one private success. And then others will hopefully follow that trend. I really kudos to Akon. Really, I hope he's able to really advance these endeavors with this. It's definitely going to be a hurdle, but if he pushes through it and he gets the right backers, and I know that China's involved. I think they are co-sponsoring, I believe, the city. So I hope that they protect their investment. I'm very much excited to see China. I don't know. I just have this image of China rolling down military aid in Africa. I just want to see what that would look like. That would be insane. The day I see that, I think it's going to be. It's just the imagery is a bit insane.
Yeah, I think in general a kind of excitement for an industrial future for Africa and African nations is something that is not really shared by Western leftists. I think Western leftists would prefer that Africans remain without access to the same things that they're able to take for granted, because they have this kind of aesthetic of Africans as one with nature, for example. They see this as somehow, while, for example, wholly taking for granted the fruits of modern industrial society. It seems to me that one of the future forms of U.S. imperialism we can anticipate is attempting to stifle the development of Africa in the name of this pseudo-ecologistic ideologies. What do you think about that?
When you say pseudo-ecologistic, are you? Because I'm hearing two things here. I'm hearing still that paternalistic view of Africa as a continent. Well, that it wouldn't be able to. It doesn't have the either social or technological capacity to be able to handle certain evolution. Or are you speaking more in terms of the environment, in terms of renewable energy sources? Which one are you on?
I'm speaking more in terms of that we're Africans too do this. Forget about the kind of racist kind of prejudices which say they can't. Even let's say they could, and I think they will eventually. I think one of the forms of Western, I think Europe already kind of does this for other countries, but Western imperialism will take the form of this kind of conservationism, that Africans have no right to develop themselves because the Europeans and the Americans will see it as a threat to nature, pretty much.
And the proximity that Africans have to like this pure natural sort of ontology.
And another form of this, another form of this racism I notice is that, it's a shame. The phenomena is a shame. But there are many poachers in Africa who need to feed their families, right? They don't have jobs, so how are you going to feed your family? It's human beings, right? But then Westerners, and there's all sorts of really dirty history here. All of these agencies, conservation agencies, so on, want to crucify these people, deny them any kind of humanity. And Western audiences do not see these people as human. They see their lives as worth less than these admittedly very beautiful animals. But when it comes to, you have to feed your family.
I definitely understand. Also, the extent to which the the idea, the imagery of the poacher is also a bit slighted in the sense that there are a lot of poachers that come from, in fact, Europe that do this as a sport.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Game. But I think definitely there is some credence to the fact that that is an idea that may be imposed upon Africans that if you develop too fast, it will harm the environment, and you're one of the last vestiges of kind of the natural landscape for humanity, and that you should preserve that. But I think that it's a double-edged sword in the sense that it does behoove the African to choose the correct development path. And I think that's where we circle back a bit to that cultural identity and that study of culture and study of history. I always give the example of the constructions of houses in Africa. The material that we use, do we really need to be using those materials? Are we using cement because it is the best thing that we could possibly use? Or are we using it because Europeans use it? You understand?
Yeah.
In a sense, does it not behoove us to maybe change the way we build? There are ways that Africans used to build in the past that, if that is properly studied, can be brought into the future. And just changing the material that you build, the way you build, the architectural design of your buildings can change completely the scope as far as energy is concerned, using clean energy, not using as much air conditioners because your place will just be naturally cool, so on and so forth. Those are things that can be done if the research is put into that. So it is in the sense as earlier referred to, Sankofa by Evan, where you are looking in the past, but you are still moving forward. I think that's a very important concept, where we have to go back into our culture and look at, really dig through and see what is essential, what is useless, cling on to the essential and move forward and meet new obstacles and use new tools to be able to develop.
Yeah, the housing is really interesting. It reminds me of how in many places in Asia they use bamboo scaffolding, to hold concrete buildings as really big skyscrapers and so on. But no, I completely agree with you. You cannot have a one-sided approach. You know what I mean? Even in I think in Asia they have a much more dynamic approach to this question of ecology and not annihilating the conditions of your own existence through industrialization. China has a much more dynamic approach than Europe and the U.S. in regards to this matter. Meanwhile, Europe and the U.S., I don't think they have this dynamism. I think they have a one-sided approach where they see the future or the modern and the past as fundamentally irreconcilable. And many ecologists hold society on the bond of we must completely return to nature and completely eliminate modern technologies. Where I think from an African perspective, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's more that not only are they compatible, but the past also gives new ground to what we consider the most futuristic horizon of technology and so on and so on. In other words, it even is more futuristic because of this wealth of the past. Because one must remember, without the past, there's no such thing as a vision of the future. Future is just the same bland, same old thing. So this wealth of particularity and practices and also paradigms from the past in these many African countries is the very raw material by which the future can be realized, right? So I think an approach to industrialization on terms different both from Europe and even probably different from Asia is definitely something I would expect. But I just meant to point out that I think ecologistic ideologies in the West, I see those in the future as being used to stifle the growth and development of African nations, even on their own unique terms.
I can see it. I agree with you on that.
So right now you're based in Burkina Faso, is that correct?
Yes, it's all.
I think Raul had maybe a question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about Thomas Sankara. Like, what is his legacy around the Burkina Faso people?
Thomas Sankara's legacy here is very much that of a messianic figure. Um, and he is essentially, you find him in Burkina Faso, you find him, his picture in every shop, every barber shop, every store, t-shirts everywhere. He is Africa's very own Che Guevara in a sense, and Burkina Faso especially. And his impact is really seen in the fact in um, this cultural fortitude that Burkina Faso has, in the sense that Burkina Faso really translates to land of the upright person. There's a heavy emphasis on integrity here in Burkina Faso. That is cannot be understated. It is something that is cultural in the sense that in the past it had its roots in the past. But Thomas Sankara, although somehow in a socialist way, was able to get back to that and remind the people of Burkina Faso of that cultural heritage. So you will find that here, there is a code. It is not exactly written. They have laws. Most of them are French laws, but they still do have laws. But there is beyond that code that respects integrity, that puts integrity at the forefront. So although I'm not going to say that long there are no thieves, there is no crime, there is a tendency towards honesty that you see. I'll just give an example. You could go to the gym and you could leave something there, and 2-3 weeks later you come back and that thing that you left there will still be there. That's a rarity wherever you go. That's not exactly super sure. And I'm saying leaving it there, just leaving it just anywhere there, and then you'll have people collected and stuff. And in a country that does not have resources, does not have the riches of, say, the Central African countries or other countries around the world, you would expect that people would be more anxious to get their hands on materials. But there is that cultural pride that stops them from doing that and that pushes them towards more integrity. And Thomas Sankara essentially represents that push. That is what he is credited for, giving them that, reminding them of that great identity, and pushing them in that direction. As well as, of course, just the uniting factor that he also put, because Burkina Faso is in fact a name that is made up of 2 different languages in Burkina Faso. Burkina is part of a certain dialect and Faso part of another dialect, but he put them together. And that is to tell you just the tribal conflicts that already just puts to rest by giving that name, including everyone in that process, essentially, or the majority in that process. There's always going to be a minority, but that is also something that he greatly contributed to. So that is the state or the figure that is Thomas Sankara. That is what he represents. That is his significance to people of Burkina Faso. Essentially, a reminder that we are greater than we are as a society if we maintain these codes of integrity.
Yeah, there's also the name Burkinabe for the people of Burkina Faso, and
Yes.
the Be is man or woman, includes the people of Burkina Faso and the people outside it.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
so it's
exactly.
universal. And
Very universal.
speaking of Pan-Africanism,
I have to say that he also thought it out very well, because normally you would say Burkinabe. Okay, let's say for example, Cameroon. If you wanted to say someone from Cameroon in French, you would say Camerounais. And if you wanted to say female, you would say Camerounaise. Now, if you were to take that and apply it to Burkinabe, it would be Burkinabe for the male and Burkinabes for the female. Bez literally means fornicate. So I think he probably saw that and then made that quick adjustment. So that is double-edged sword and how he was able to say that. But indeed, very very ingenious use of linguistics to avoid a potential conflict. And there's also another peculiar thing that I have to point out here, where as you know, slave culture in Africa is prevalent, and here they essentially use that and they take it and they kind of flip it. There's something called plaisanterie, or I don't know how to translate that in English, but essentially you'll find that if a person has a certain name and a certain person has another name, say Ouedraogo and Salvador. Let's say that during a certain time in the past, the people from Salvador conquered a region of the Ouedraogos. They will say, "Oh, you're my slave," and that guy might respond and say, "No, you're my slave." And they kind of use that as not as a form of calling themselves slaves, but as a form of saying that all that history may have been history, but we are brothers. And it's funny how they just use that to actually use that as a unifying force, as opposed to something that could be very divisive. I mean, if you go to, say, like the U.S. and you call someone a slave, it might not like turn out as well. So it's definitely some unique practices here in Burkina Faso.
Continuing with the question, still on the legacy of Sankara, a major project that he had throughout his administration was Women's Liberation Project. So I was just curious, and we see that too, even with the name, as you had just pointed out. But I was curious, what's been the legacy of the women's liberation struggle in Burkina Faso post his assassination and coup?
Well, what you observe here is essentially the roles that are played by women here, a lot more diverse than you would see in West Africa, Central Africa, I think maybe East Africa to a certain degree, and in South Africa. You will find here that they are females occupying jobs, truck drivers, security guards, a lot of roles that you are not usually accustomed to seeing women in. And as far as the government as well, there is a very high level of women involved in the Burkinabe government and governmental affairs. And women's rights is not a joking matter in this country as well. So I think that is the impact that Thomas Sankara has had, essentially empowering the woman. Again, it is somehow cultural because the founding myth of Burkina Faso, or the predominant tribe in Burkina Faso, the Mosi, their founding myth is based off of a Princess Yenega. So, and she is essentially the founding mother of, her son is the founding father of Burkina Faso. But matrilineal links actually point more to her and give her a lot more credit than the actual son who founded the kingdom. So essentially, in a way, again, Thomas Sankara's empowerment of women is in fact a return to African cultural identity as a whole. So that is the role. Really, essentially, you will find that women are occupying a lot more spaces that are traditionally held by men, and they do so with ease. Is there a stigma? Yes. Well, you cannot be in a world that is westernized and then not have that stigma. And even within the African world, there is a limited stigma in that sense, and that is still there because women have physical, obviously, things that people who base their assumptions on the physical will be opponents of that. But essentially, in terms of policy and in terms of cultural norms, the woman has human rights, and she is empowered. And essentially, they are they are ready for a female president at any moment if it presents itself. It will be welcome.
So is this all just like essentially is Sankara still remembered, or is he a popular figure among common people, or is this just a legacy which is he laid the foundation for it and then he's forgotten by many people?
He is not forgotten. Thomas Sankara is he's like Mao Zedong. You're not allowed to forget him if you're in Burkina Faso.
Like as you pointed out, people have portraits of him in the stores. Pointed it out.
You just can't forget it. The only thing they haven't done is put him on the money. If they did that would be a little bit more obvious. But other than that, he's pretty much everywhere, and he's an idol. I can't. Yeah, like I said, the only thing I can compare him to is essentially Mao Zedong, George Washington, maybe.
Maybe like Lenin in the former Soviet Union, right?
I'd say maybe Stalin even. Like it all reminds me a lot of Stalin.
Well,
like
Stalin,
bringing all this progress, and still today he's even by the reactionaries they worship him or remember him to a certain extent.
But in the immediate aftermath, he had no like legacy in the Soviet Union. Like that was official legacy, But I was curious. So in Burkina Faso, would you say it's a primarily rural or primarily urban country?
Primarily rural.
And what is the how should I put it? The agricultural unit, so to speak, the most base agricultural unit, you would say. Like, is it small scale family intensive agriculture as many other countries, or is it big landowners, things like that?
There is an element of small scale, but you have to remember Burkina Faso is essentially in the Sahel. So the farming is not very much farming. There are farms, there are regions of it, but if you look at the map of Burkina Faso, you'll find it's mostly it's that color of sand and then just little green streaks around the city in the south.
What's the primary industry of Burkina Faso then? Like, what do they produce?
Cotton, gold. So that is essentially where the basis is, cotton and gold. They are rumors of oil, but there has been a lot of efforts to keep that under wraps because of the kind of attention that it attracts. And I think they kind of felt at that because that attention is already kind of here as far as terrorist attacks and the like. But yes, it is essentially a country that the NGO presence here is incredible. The company I work for, I was trying to get some signs up, and you'll go on just like a curb, and you'll see a bunch of NGO signs, UN this, cross that, and all these things. They are rampant here. So it is very much. I don't think Sankara would appreciate it, but it's very much a bit in the gearings of a welfare state, in the sense that they receive a lot of aid from several NGOs. So that is an issue as well.
So, especially in the rural areas, what is the primary means of occupation for people?
What do you mean in terms of jobs?
Well, maybe not. It can be jobs, but also just a general source of income. How are people getting by and large?
People are getting by essentially by working with the government, along with the government and small businesses. But a lot of people, there is a push to get into the government, to get into civil service. Because that is seen as essentially the most viable option. Private entities most of them that come out are from foreign countries, usually France. Um, there is, I must say, not too much of a strong undercurrent of entrepreneurship, even though that is changing slowly but surely with this wave of technology. People are beginning to see that they can actually launch their own businesses and be a little bit more independent. But as I said, they were a bit hampered by that lack of infrastructure. They got 4G 2 years ago. So that already tells you the situation that they find themselves in. So but I suspect that as that changes, they will begin to see that there is the viable option, and it will begin to increase. So essentially, right now, civil service. You work for the government, you know you have a salary, and that's essentially the way where most people want to go.
So
if they're not piling up at the embassies trying to get permits so they can leave. Even though Burkinabe really love their country, so no matter how long they go, they won't stay for long. They'll usually come back.
would you say there's a lot of demographic for the primarily a situation of demographic mobility for the countryside, like people living in the villages, but then you have a provider who leaves and procures the main source of income, or if they're trying to get into government service, I imagine in relatively isolated villages, what is the primary things they do, basically, after acquiring such jobs?
I would say the primary thing that is done, it's mostly handiwork. It's mostly handiwork. What I've seen, the vast majority of the population is in that sphere. You find a lot of people on bicycles and like. There is a semblance of the middle class in the sense that those are people who are more educated, who are able to secure higher jobs. But if you're in the countryside, you're mainly occupied with farming. And when you move into the city, it's because you have a qualification. If you don't have a qualification, then you're moving into the city and you're going to be a household. And you're going to be this or that, or plumber, or those different jobs. So that is essentially the structure and how it takes place. So really, there is. I try to think of this majority job that most people are having, and I couldn't tell you off the top of what most people have, and I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. But I know that education and all that is not really at the forefront. Investments have not been made too much in that direction. I myself find myself in the educational sphere. I work with an NGO that is currently doing that, and you'll find that emphasis on education is not very high, not very high. So a lot of people will skip education, a lot of people will get into education, and if they get in, they usually go straight through bachelor's, get their master's, and then once they get their master's, they want to get a government job. And so you see, that's kind of like the limits. Like boom, 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 get a government job, or boom, 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 go to university outside, and then essentially leave and then come back for the holidays.
Many states, the primary source of revenue for the government is those extractive industries, be it oil or, as you mentioned, gold, and there's also a cotton industry. Would you say Burkina Faso is the same? The primary means of revenue for the government is these kinds of base materials, minerals, which they then find ways of dividing among the population through these different jobs and so on and so on.
I would say it is that, and there are also considerable amount of loans that they take out.
From where are the loans chiefly coming from? I know it's a CFA zone country, so these is probably the Central Bank of France, right?
Central Bank, the IMF. You understand what I'm saying? So that borrowing is also a big issue.
Yeah, right.
Big Burkina Faso in the sense that they will get a lot of their money from those institutions. So it kind of puts the country in a situation of debt further down the line. But that is where most of it is coming from. But essentially, yes, it is those extractive resources that they rely upon for the most part.
And is Burkina Faso? I know it may be difficult to know. Is it on the map of for China's Belt and Road Initiative?
I believe so.
What kinds of infrastructure are the Chinese investing in and building, or do they anticipate to?
Mostly in mining. So that is mostly in mining. There is an old tracks that are here, but I haven't seen anyone talk of any construction of that. But I know that Burkina Faso is definitely in the sphere of it, because if my knowledge serves me, in Africa, they go far west, and I'm pretty sure they do. And so it would have to be within the sphere of influence. Burkina's proximity to countries like Mali and stuff, it just you can't discount it. It would be heavily influenced by that. And the Chinese population here, as in most places in Africa, is insignificant, and their presence is felt.
Over the past few years, I'm not sure when it began. I think there was some degree of civil unrest across West Africa, primarily in protest of the arrangement with France and the influence of France and also the various corrupt governments. Was that felt in Burkina Faso recently?
Yes, it was. I would say the enemy was not so much France, because there's two big movements that took place, which is one is this collective movement, which I'd love to say that it is unanimous, but it is still debated as to the sphere and what to do and how to move forward, and the fact that it is in fact a trap currency. It weakens your foreign exchange. It essentially stops your countries from being able to operate as a sovereign state. And so that discussion was being had, and we had African countries that were for and against. So that was that discussion. Now, getting specific to Burkina Faso, what we had, and I believe it was 2016, was a sort of coup that took place, not like a coup, but essentially the ruler, Blaise, who had been ruler since the death of Sankara, was ousted by the people. It wasn't a CIA-fronted operation, or any external forces were not involved as far as we know, because Blaise would generally acquiesce to the French and their demands. But what it was just a popular rising of the people, a discontentment with his rule, particularly, and his family's, the nepotism of
when
the
was
political.
This? 2018.
Yes.
Okay.
It was something that started in 2016, and it kind of bubbled. And then by the time it got to started before 2016 actually. And it bubbled in 2016 and 2017 with the ousting of Blaise and installment of essentially a new political party, which of course has a lot of the members from the old political party, but nonetheless has a new rule. And so essentially that is what took place. But I have to say that there was a great facilitator, or a person named Sani Jallo, who really facilitated that transition, and he passed as soon as I had arrived here in October of 2017. I arrived here and he passed literally a week after. And after that happened, we have someone who is in place, who is put as president, who is essentially a businessman, someone who has always been part of the aristocratic class of Burkina Faso. and he's essentially a businessman. He is not a master politician, and nor is he a visionary in any way, shape, or form. So they are now having to deal with that leadership issue. But essentially, those were the two movements. The realization that the fossil fuel was bad and the beginning of the discussion, which culminated with the African Union banding together and trying to create a currency known as the eco currency that would band together all these Franco colonies into and basically give them a currency that they would be able to use. And then the French co-opted that as well. So that's it's an ongoing struggle.
I heard about that, the eco. I'm not too familiar with the details surrounding it, but I did hear that it essentially was, and it became an extension of the CFA franc.
Exactly.
Yeah. I have. Sorry, Evan. Did you want to say something?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I didn't realize I was muted. What I understand is the distinction between the two is with the CFA. Not only is it pegged to the franc and euro, but half of the reserves are kept in the French treasury. With the eco, on the other hand, though it's still pegged, the reserves are no longer within the French treasury. But other than that, so I mean, you get this quote unquote stable currency with low inflation, but discourages industrialization. So you can't really, as you had said, it retards development.
Yeah, and pegged to the French currency automatically means French industrial edge, imports of French goods, as opposed to the cultivation of domestic industry. That's the whole reason why France demands this control of the currencies of West Africa. It wants its industries, its exports to continue, as opposed to developing their own. But I have a hypothesis, and I'm interested in hearing your views on it. Studying the protests in Africa, even before 2018, I came to the conclusion that this recent spout, especially in Sudan, it was a similar situation in Sudan, to my knowledge. You had this kind of transition led by the military general after the people overthrew Bashir. I'm sorry if I'm not mispronouncing it. I hypothesize that much of the civil unrest we've witnessed in 2018 and 2019, from the French Yellow Vest to further, historically somehow originated in Africa, because the protests seem to be similar in essence. As far as the relation to civil society, how they've originated and spread, and so on and so on, social media and so on and so on. It seems to me like inadvertently, it's almost like though it doesn't get much attention, the political events that are happening across, specifically West Africa, but across Africa, are almost like seismic undercurrents. Right? They're not immediately clear at first how they will eventually culminate in these explosions you see elsewhere, but it seems to me that historically, at least, not directly in a causal way, but historically, what we're seeing not so much originates, but it starts first. It's revealed first in Africa, if that makes sense. These revolutionary changes in the civil society. What do you think about that?
I think it's possible. I think it's possible because, indeed, if at any moment there is a shift in the balance of power, it is perceivable that Africa will feel the brunt of it, because Africa is such a chessboard of a continent where there are many pieces that are at play from external forces. And when they move, or if there's a general shift, the African population may feel it perhaps harder in certain instances and react to it. And what is seen, especially in the external by the other countries outside of Africa, is mostly those explosions, those reactions. Some of them are contrived, others are just, as I said, with Burkina Faso, just a kind of took on its own. It was just a natural, like the country just kind of was getting rid of something, as opposed to it being manipulated by external forces. But I do agree with you that might be a hypothesis worth supporting, because Africa generally will be affected by issues that concern the world because of world powers, investments, geopolitical plays that they have in place in Africa.
And it's also pegging off of this question of the archaeo-modernism, namely that arrogantly Westerners see civil unrest in Africa and see this as just, oh, that's just Africa, it's just simple turbulence. But if you look closely, you can see hints of the future of their own countries, is what I mean to say.
Yes.
And I think this has actually played out in actual reality.
I think it's the way capitalism works.
Mm-hmm.
The way capitalism works. Philosophically, in a sense, history works. The fall of empires and empire is eternal. But essentially, I think what COVID-19 kind of tested was, you say you are capitalist and you are masters of capitalism. Okay, how do you deal with this capitalism? How do you deal with this pandemic? And I believe that this is one of the instances, again, where Africa is kind of looked at as, okay, what happened here? You guys are usually the ones who get the brunt of this, but somehow this wave didn't hit you as hard. What's going on? And I think, yeah, in that sense, there is an irony, a bit of an irony that the idea of Africa may not always correspond to the reality of the situation. And I think that capitalism has this cyclical nature. And people may say that it is predictable, but it could not predict COVID-19. And it was not prepared for it. And I think that in itself, I'm not sure that right now what I'm seeing in the political sphere is people just being very reactionary, where people are pushing for an extreme on one end or on another. But it really does have to be studied that, okay, where do we go from here? As we were just speaking during the break, that even ads or campaigns will become kind of redundant because of this new reality that is faced by capitalism. And I think that these protests, I was even speaking with Evan, that these Black Lives Matter protests or protests that are all over the world, I don't think they're all too linked to Black Lives Matter. I think they're also a product of a general discontentment and just using this Black Lives Matter as a vehicle for that.
Yeah, that's what we said was the case for a lot of the white people in the U.S. who were coming out to protest. A lot of primarily white communities even that had no black people at all. It's nice to show solidarity, of course, but I think the primary thrust was response to coronavirus and the changes corresponding to it. But it's interesting because according to, you mentioned capitalism and so on, it's, for me at least, I view capitalism as, in a sense, not totally, but in a previous sense of modern industrial capitalism, as already obsolete. I view China's system as having already pretty much prevailed and proven its superiority to the Western kind. So I think in the African context, the Western capitalism is, as far as for future-oriented thinkers, people who are thinking about what must we do, I don't even think it's on the table, the Western-style capitalism. I think they're looking at the Chinese model, but also beyond the Chinese model, in the same way that the Chinese model was beyond the Western kind. So, but also there's a theory, there's one interpretation of the theory of combined and uneven development. Are you familiar with this theory of combined and uneven development?
No.
Yeah, the basic thrust of it is that there's never a pure capitalism, right? Capitalism is always intertwined with other types of economic forms that it kind of parasitizes off, it corresponds to, it synergistically relates to. So you have that kind of dynamic. And one interpretation, the one I subscribe to, which is that when when it appears that somewhere is the most backward, where capitalism, global capitalism, is on the frontier, so to speak, of this past, that is actually the site of, let's say, contemporary history as it is actually unfolding. And I think that's the case for Africa. I think Africa, more than Asia, more than anywhere else in the world maybe, is a site where modern global capitalism confronts social forms it is unable to fully assimilate, and that the synthesis or the encounter on this basis is the only real site of maybe truly, purely contemporary history unfolding. Whereas the history that's unfolding in America or Europe, even Asia, is not strictly contemporary history. It's a history that carries the inertia of the past in a sense. Only I think in Africa do we witness a real site of fresh contemporary history, which will have implications for the whole of the world in the future. In the same way that now China, it's revealed how China is having an implication for the whole entire world, right? The Western pathology and mind would have said China is the past and we're already ahead of China. But because of the unique encounter between Chinese civilization and modernity, China proved that it was ahead of the West. That was the site of a fresh historical development, and the West was in fact the one who was in the past. The same before China was Russia and so on. But
yes. To hear, as I say, your optimism is baffling. I gotta say no, because this is something to hear from someone that is not of African descent. It is just it's rare. They've never had that in the sense that I can agree with you, and I really do. It is something that is conceivable, but I believe that there is a shift, a paradigm shift that needs to take place. A paradigm shift that shifts away from people and powerful personalities and more towards powerful institutions and principles. And I think that shift, once it is done, will be able to facilitate that. Because as I do predict, I do see that those changes that are currently taking place and will continue to take place, I believe that they will take place. But I believe that without strong leaders, Africans will not be able to control the direction of that change. And that is my biggest concern, because once that wave comes, we have to be able to direct it. If not, it will wash away a lot of the identity, a lot of the standing structures that there are, and there are very few that are there, and that it will be replaced by something that is essentially the extra state or just not African. And I think that is the line that has to be walked by any Pan-Africanist or anyone that is considering themselves an Africanist in any shape or form. But I do agree with you that it is, as it was in the past, Africa may find itself once again at the forefront, 1884 all over again. But I would just appreciate it if I would prefer that this time, as it is being cut, that African leaders be able to give their input. And I think that is my biggest concern. But I agree with you, and I agree with the vision. No, my concern is that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's not simply a passive, fatalistic kind of thing that's just going to happen, and Africans are just going to sit around and wake up to a completely different circumstance. There is a need to, as Mao Zedong said, to seize the day, right? Because if one does not seize the day, there is always the threat of this what they call in the Bolshevik party, they used to call liquidationism. There's a threat of modernity that it will simply liquidate the entirety of the people and their past and their history and so on, and subsume them in this kind of horrific, uniform, almost slavery, right? So I completely understand where you're coming from, of this need to seize the day.
We have institutions that are able to back that.
Yes, and I also think social media has opened up very interesting possibilities and horizons as far as that's concerned, because the nature of organization, the nature of institutions building, and the dissemination of principles, and the manner by which people demonstrate their loyalty to principles has completely changed with this new digital age, as they call it, or cybernetic age, whatever you want to call it. The paradigm of the one strongman leader, who this kind of great chain of being that flows in this pyramid type of way, is over, right? So,
Yeah.
so I think in the African context, it is already primed to take advantage of the new possibilities given by social media. And that's where Evan and I's interest is also very relevant to this, in this notion of the army, right? For us, an army is not only a violent force to have guns and so on, shoot, these kinds of things. An army is also a paradigm of how it is that collectives can form around common causes and principles and so on. And not only common causes, but also common points of unity, so to speak.
Yes.
Not simply in terms of the unity of a principle or the unity of an idea, but also even the unity of a type of being, right? A type of way of life, a type of maybe nation, something like that. Do you kind of follow what I'm saying with this? Or?
Yes. I think that army, as you say, is something that is progressive in the sense that if you have those unifying factors, then it kind of foregoes kind of the obsession with a one leader, because we know that those factors are essentially the unifying the goal. The goal is those common issues, those common threads that we have, and then we just work towards that, as opposed to obsessing over one leader or another. And that's just, I think, yeah. So, army in that sense is definitely, I think, more positive and can get more results.
Yeah, and during the Chinese Cultural Revolution, there was a huge explosion of the cult of personality of Mao Zedong. But it was also in its dialectic way, also because it was the end of the cult of personality. It was so intense because it was the final last stand of this kind of way. And the big achievement of the Cultural Revolution, actually, the point of unity, was this little red book. Anyone can have this little red book. It's not just one leader. Anyone can step up and recite its quotations and thereby equally participate politically in this movement. And my view is that the little red books that they had in this Cultural Revolution only precipitated this little red book, right? The smartphone. And I think in Africa, it is already, the people will in time already, if they're not already, be equipped with this kind of little red book as the relation to the higher movement and policies and so on.
Indeed. I think that move is already taking place. It will have to find a way to safeguard against manipulation, because as you said, social media is a tool, a very powerful tool. But I'm sure that you've all heard of rumors around Trump's campaign and how social media was utilized. I think even before that, the Obama campaign kind of utilized social media to the foremost extent. And Trump's is, of course, seen as malicious because of the left and the way they just tend to see things. But how you can see that social media can be used in the recent attacks, those recent xenophobic attacks that took place in South Africa, blown greatly out of proportion in the social media.
Absolutely. Sorry.
I was there doing, I happened to be there doing 3 spikes of xenophobia before this one. So there was one in 2005, there was one in 2008, and there was one in 2016. And I was there in South Africa doing almost 3 phases. And so when I was now here in Burkina Faso, when I witnessed some of the footage being leaked and going viral, it was old footage. And it was these new headlines of, oh, this needs to happen, oh, that needs to happen. And it's like, but that's old footage. That's footage from 2017 that you're showing in 2020 as if it happened in 2020. You know, so it is those kind of things that we'll have to safeguard against. But indeed, I think it will require a sort of, there has to be an African Facebook.
That's what I was going to say.
There has to be an African Microsoft. Those things need to take place in order for Africa to be able to direct that wave that is oncoming. Without that, it will be difficult to be able to stay at the forefront. Because remember, you are able to change once you're able to control direction, you're able to also change direction if you are at the forefront. So essentially, you have your own systems, and they're conducting analysis on where do we need to be in the next 20 years. And I don't subscribe to essentially the linear form of Rostow's theory of development, where it's okay, we're just going one way, and these guys are leading the way. I believe that Africa's condition, it requires someone to look at the African landscape and say, okay, where does Africa need to go? And how do we need to navigate? And it requires us to be at the forefront of our movement to see that.
Yeah.
Because, just one last point, just because if someone who is in the forefront of those movements does not take into consideration the cultural and social landscape of Africa, they will run into trouble, as they already did when they cut up the continent like the Cape, not taking into consideration tribal or other history.
Yeah, that's why for me, this struggle, as anywhere, must be dual-faceted.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is that you, on the one hand, you have this decentral social media and all this kind of stuff, this little red book, right? But at the same time, this also gives ground to the need of a new tendency and striving toward centralization. Because in order for this to be possible, what do you need? Infrastructure, right? You need platforms, like as you mentioned, Facebook, and with this huge manipulations, as you mentioned, with Cambridge Analytica, and the way those work is that they compile people's data, harvest their data, and then target specific types of people and amplify tendencies. I think these are weapons that could easily be used by the revolutionaries, as much as they're used by the counter-revolutionaries and the enemies. And but this tendency and striving towards centralization, I think the way I look at it is like this. The tendency towards centralization is a tendency toward, which is the state power, infrastructure, all these kind of things. This is something that comes from the rule. It comes from the tradition, the past, the culture, the things you mentioned. All of these things that are the, let's say, being, right, of African nations, right? This is in the Russian Revolution, the slogan was the unity of the workers and the peasants. And I think this division plays out in interesting ways elsewhere. I think on the peasant side of things, there's a need to centralize, there's a need to have control, there's a need to preserve the tradition, there's a need to establish the identity, as you put it. Establish, not so much establish, but preserve the wisdom of the past. That's a good way of putting it. But on the other hand, you have the decentralized tendency of the urban and young people, primarily the young people, who are looking toward the new technologies and so on and so on. And I think the key to revolution, to me, is the unity of both of these factors. When it becomes one-sided, on the one hand, if it becomes one-sided on the urban level, then the urban revolutionaries will inevitably turn against the people in the country, right? They will become modern, and then they will attack the rural people for being backward, right? Is what usually happens.
Exactly.
But then if the rural people neglect the achievement of the modern and the new, then it gives rise to cynicism, gives rise to lethargy, inertia, lack of political initiative, support for corrupt strongmen, and so on and so on. So there's a need to unify both of these elements. And I think the key to all revolution and social change lies in this dialectic between the two elements, proletariat and the peasantry, you know?
Definitely. I think I would add to that, and I'm sure Evan would agree, a need for a renaissance, a cultural renaissance. I think that is something that is, I believe, will facilitate that greatly. You look at any country after any form of renaissance, it owns its history and essentially moves forward. And I think that is something that needs to take place.
Yes, every renaissance is the actualization by way of culture of this dialectic that I mentioned. You know, and one of the neglected renaissance, of course, the Western histories will deny and slander and distort. But really, one of the renaissances was in Russia in the 30s, under Stalin even. Because you had this newfound significance of the Russian peasants and Russian culture, you had this flourishing of Russian literature, of books, music, ways of thinking that were of the non-Western kind. China is now experiencing or had experienced a similar renaissance, especially culturally across the board. So I think these examples point to not things to replicate and mimic, because there were many mistakes and so on, but there are paradigms of renaissance, I think, that an African renaissance would do good to take seriously, in addition to the traditional Italian renaissance of the 16th, 15th centuries.
Yes.
And there have been points throughout African liberation movements when that renaissance begins to emerge, and that's at times when they are most potent and when the most achievements are won, most victories are won. For example, in the United States, a lot with the Black Power movement and what was going on, combining the Black Power movement with a return to African cultural values, we saw great strides in African communities within the United States.
Yeah, I always say that in America, our problem, the biggest obstacle to a revolutionary momentum of some kind in the U.S., it's not a problem of masses. The masses are ready for revolution. It's not a problem of anything except we need partisans. We need, I call the partisan is the one who is educated across the board. Not only are they educated in memorizing facts and so on, but they also acquire what I like to call an aesthetic, which means a higher sense. They're able to acquire a higher sense from the fruits of literature, from the fruits of art, culture, these kinds of things. This type of person, this type of partisan, this is what we lack in America. If we had these types of people, you could do anything. You could move mountains. You just need this type of partisan. because the partisan is one who is neither only in heaven, urban, or only rule and earth. The partisan is the synthesis of both in a sense, which is that they use the powers of the modern, they use the power of education, they use the power of technology to exhume, develop, distill, and cultivate what is in the rule, what is in the people, what is in the past. They give voice to the people striving and to the traditions, the culture, and so on of the people by using what traditionally is opposed to the people, which is this kind of modern technology and so on.
It was beautifully put. That was very well put. I think that would definitely it definitely behooves Pan-Africanist movement to think in that way, to think in that form, and to work towards that. And I believe it is taking place. But as you say, generations to come will have to carry on that struggle. They will definitely have to carry on that struggle. I think one of the biggest things that I think would have to underlie that renaissance would be the educational system that are in various African countries that would have to have within them an element, almost a revolutionary undercurrent, but without calling them revolutionary, as it is, and in a sense that, and not even because I see that a lot in the Afrocentric community, there is a push and there is a tendency to say our history as opposed to, instead of saying our history, point blank, period. And I believe that as Africa, especially in its particular context of Africa, does not need to compare itself necessarily with others, as it is in fact the first, it's where humanity began. So it just needs to state its history and do it in almost a self-actualizing way, not comparing itself to others with that. And I see that a lot in the Afrocentric community, where and then also the Pan-African community, where it will find itself at odds trying to battle something outright. And it's almost like you're trying to throw punches at a brick wall. And the brick wall is Western institutions, Western society, and then you're trying to fight them head on instead of building yourself up to the point where now you start to build your own walls and they have to kind of leave their walls to come and find out what's going on over there. Where I think that is that shift that needs to take place, and education has to have an undercurrent of that, where our textbooks have to speak in a way that is self-actualizing. China, if you look at the map of the world in China, China is at the center. Now, Africa happens to be in the same line as Europe, so we can't really play that game necessarily, but I just say that the mentality has to be like that. When the Chinese educational system, they don't use European historians to affirm their own history. We do. That's a big issue. So I think in the educational system, that undercurrent has to be there, where it is just you affirming your own history and essentially building up your own identity through your own research, not excluding anyone else's research, but just putting your research based on even their other people's findings to the forefront, so that you can just start to rebuild your identity. And then once that is done, those processes that you highlighted will be a lot easier, because it will not come with a concept known as a knowledge deficit, where you take on knowledge that doesn't apply to your particular context, and so it hurts you when you're trying to develop because you're not taking into consideration your concept. I know it feels like as I'm speaking, it feels like I keep going back to the same concepts. But that it's just something that I feel that that's just something, an undercurrent that needs to take place. That it is revolutionary, but we don't label it as revolutionary. And I feel that that is something that I don't know if you've noticed that, because I see that there's a lot of, when the revolution is coming, there is sometimes a tendency to want to label it as such. And I feel that we need to be a lot more subtle.
You know,
A lot.
sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's so beautifully put what you said. It's a need to exhume the positive and the particular, rather than simply dwell in a perpetual and permanent negation.
Mm-hmm.
And that is precisely the stuff of Renaissance. Renaissance is not simply when you declare war against an enemy, but when you cultivate a wealth of particularity that is almost indifferent to the enemy in a sense, right? It's your own thing you're doing. That is really the stuff of Renaissance. And in fact, if I know I'm doing it too much, bring it back to the history of Bolshevism. This is precisely where Stalin and Trotsky diverged. Trotsky was someone who wanted the revolution, or the Russian Revolution, to dwell in this permanent negation, this permanent destruction of the old. But Stalin, in his notion of socialism in one country, viewed it as necessary to cultivate the particular, to not focus so much on attacking the enemy and on the permanent revolution, but let's actually sit before what we have already and develop our unique reality. And so I really love the way you put it and described this need to, because at first I thought you meant just because it will get you in trouble with the governments, that you don't call yourself revolutionary. But now I see the deeper point you've made. One should not always call themselves or focus on being revolutionary because it neglects the side of positive being. And this is another way of presenting this dichotomy of the urban and the rural I mentioned. Primarily, the urban is focused on the negative, right? The destruction of the old in favor of the new. But the rural is not just the negative. The rural also carries with it the wealth and particularity of the past. The rural is on the side of positive being. And the whole point of this dialectic of Renaissance is so that the heaven, the urban, can use the weapon of negation, not to destroy the positive being, but to clarify it, to distill it, and to discover in it what is most fundamental.
Most useful, yeah. Most useful, yeah. Definitely. I agree 1,000% with what you said. That's what the silence is.
I know, yeah. I'm just trying to think about what we can veer into.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up a question like, how do you see Germany's role in Africa in general? Like, I have only a very vague idea. It's usually not a very big thing in the news. You just here in Germany, you just hear something about Merkel doing some flights to Africa, to South Africa. She was even in Burkina Faso, I think. But what's actually on the table here?
From what I can tell, I really, it's one of those things where Germany, I'm sure you're more versed on its history than I. I mainly deal with its links with Africa, with the African world. But I feel that as Germany has been repeatedly cut off from any colonial opportunities after the war, Germany has kind of had to go through a paradigm shift of their own and looked inward. And essentially, the reason why earlier on I said they are the next masters, if you will, is because Germany has superseded the reliance that countries like France have on colonies. They just don't have it because they never they were not given they were stripped essentially of their colonies, and they had to look inwards. So, from what I've seen of Germany's role in Africa, it its involvement seems more diplomatic than anything else. Their economic interests, I believe, maybe rely on certain companies, shell companies, mostly NGOs. I don't know of too many German transnationals making big moves in Africa. I'm sure they do have certain investments, but I don't.
From what I've heard, there's this thing called development help. You essentially give money to undeveloped countries, they call it. But from what I've heard, it usually goes to German companies and whatever. German companies in Africa.
Yes, that is. Well, that's essentially capitalism. So I don't.
Yeah,
those
sure.
are the kind of things that I just put on capitalism and just see that's just the way it works. Cookie crumbles if the leadership is not able to hold companies accountable, tax properly, and such things like that will happen. But what I would say is just since I know that they don't have a heavy reliance on it, I don't know that they need to as much as, say, a country like France. So that's what I've just noticed about Germany as a whole. Now, if you have anything, if you have any other information, that's.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, the way I always look at Germany is that for me, Germany is where Europe in its particularity begins, right? The United Kingdom and France had up to a certain point only defined themselves in relation to the outside world. But only when we begin with Germany does Europe begin to look inward, as you say, and discover itself in its particularity. But then there's also trouble when you go further eastward, right? Germany had colonial ambitions in the Slavic countries, and to this day, I think the European Union, which is centered in the German banks, has this kind of neo-colonial relation to Southern and Eastern Europe. But I think, despite that, it's still within Europe. Germany is not as opposed to France. Germany is proves something internal to Europe. In other words, not to the rest of the world. But at the same time, I wonder the extent, and I wanted to study this. I just haven't had the time. To what extent is the European Union as a whole, which is this kind of, at its essence, a unity of Franco-Germania is what I like to call it, the European Union. It's the symbiosis of Germany and France. That actually goes back to the Middle Ages, if you want to go back to that. To what extent is it dependent upon France's colonial dependencies in West Africa? To what extent does the euro sustain by this? It's an interesting question that I always like to discover.
I think it is very reliant, particularly if you speak of the euro being something that is, if France is involved, the more stake that France has in the European Union and its standing in the European Union depends on that franc CFA relation in Africa. If they lose that, they essentially could see themselves become a German colony the next day. You know what I'm saying? Not in a literal sense, but just figuratively.
Yeah, sorry. France's independent industry would collapse. It'd just become an import. And traditionally, the European Union was founded in that way. France began as simply consumers of German exports. And this relation is what gave rise to the... France is actually the one who pushed Germany for the common currency in the first place, for this reason.
Wow.
To help develop French industry, because it was lagging behind the Germans. So the French basically said, okay, let's get married. We're kind of going to force it on you so we can develop our own industry. But I wonder to what extent the German banks, maybe they may not know how, depend upon this. Because from the perspective of the German banks, whether it's in Greece or elsewhere, they view themselves as the benevolent ones. We're helping you. We don't need you. We have our own independent industry. And I think this is a kind of hypocrisy. I think they secretly rely upon this colonies, so to speak, just in ways they don't know or can acknowledge. But we're kind of veering off from.
By association, I agree with you. By association, they must. By association, because if they have that.
Because nothing's free, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Nothing is free, and I think, but I think maybe it's just maybe my paradigm, because I'm seeing it as from the French perspective, that also gives them a standing. So it's kind of a catch-22 where, okay, Germany would like France to keep those colonies so that they can continue to benefit off from that. But also, if France were to lose those colonies, they would literally be at the mercy of Germany, more so than they are now. They kind of are because of, as you say, the reserve reserve banks being German, but it would be a little worse if they were to lose their colonies. Because if you look at a lot of other European smaller countries, they are not doing so well. They are really not. They're really struggling.
And you know, when Sarkozy accused Gaddafi's plan of being an existential threat to the financial security of mankind, you know, he said mankind. We know what mankind means. It means the European Charter of Human Rights. So he was probably talking about correctly that it would lead to a financial explosion in the European Union as a whole, which wouldn't affect the German banks. So I think there is this kind of hypocrisy that is at play by the German banks and the German ruling class.
Definitely, but they're doing a very great job.
Yeah, but at the same, by the same token, sorry.
Just whenever we talk of Pan-Africanism or foes or potential, Germany never comes up.
Yeah. But I meant to say, by the same token, there's a lot to be admired about Germany. You know, there's a lot to be admired about its export economy, and I know a lot of countries look at that and they want to learn from it. You know, so that it's a dual faceted. I think, as far as the lessons from Germany that are to be learned from up and coming nations.
I kind of want to ask a question, but I don't know if it will take us off on a tangent.
No, whatever. Ask whatever.
I wanted to know if in Germany, I know that the topic of Hitler and his the kind of shift that he pushed. I have recently come into contact with information that has told me that Hitler was in fact financed by private entities in the U.S.
Yep.
In England. To be able to push this war forward that essentially got the U.S. to where it is today. But I've also heard that Hitler was one of the people behind a certain shift that took place in Germany in terms of their mentality. And I wanted to know if in Germany, if that's the case, because if he was in fact someone that was manipulated from outside, was that revolution generally from him? Was he actually the figure that led that, or was there someone else? I just want to know what your thoughts were on that, and because I'm not exactly sure, because I hear both sides and I'm like, well, okay, he may have instituted some changes, but if he was being controlled, were those changes contrived? Were they just to be able to benefit his aims? What exactly to benefit imperialist aims, or what exactly was the case there?
So I know Aled should be the one speaking, but I just want to say really quick, my limited knowledge of this is that Germany was an experiment, in a sense, by the English and American sections of the American ruling class and the English elites. They didn't want themselves to go all the way like that, but they bankrolled Hitler because they wanted to see what it would come to, what would happen. So it's not necessarily that they controlled him, but in a sense, they indirectly did, because they themselves didn't have all their skin in the game. They just wanted to but the main thrust of their support for Hitler was, one, the arms, the war, the financial interest in starting another war. That's an obvious one. But I think the most important one was that they wanted to unleash the mad dog upon the Soviet Union. They wanted to destroy and dismember the Soviet Union through Hitler. But Aled should be the one to.
Yeah, I mean, I second that. That's basically it. Yes.
Yeah, because Hitler's theories. It's very interesting because they are not really German in character. The ideology of Nazism. Part of it is, obviously, a big part of it is, but many of the ideas, the racialism, eugenics, all this stuff is coming from where? California. It's coming from England. These are Anglo-Saxon dogmas that were imported by the Germans. They weren't. See, the Germans always were more metaphysical, right? They never had this traditional, vulgar, scientific, so-called scientific reductionism. That's something that they got from the English and the Anglo. So, there's a lot of ways of seeing Nazism as an extension of the barbarism of Anglo-Saxon civilization, rather than just the German.
Well, it's funny. I was referring more to, because that's interesting point. I was referring more to the economic aspect of it. And I was just curious to see if that was as well. Well, as you say, it was part of an experiment. I'm sure the economics was actually kind of the focal point of the experiment. I guess you could say.
Definitely. Yeah.
That they wanted to see how his economic model would take shape and form in Germany.
Yeah, actually, a league of businessmen in the United States formed a big scandal. It was called the Businessmen's Plot, and they wanted to replicate Nazism economically and so on in the United States and overthrow the then President FDR. And the whole thing was exposed by one of the high-ranking military figures whose name was Smedley Butler in the United States. So they were looking at Germany as also an economic model. Can this allow us to become profitable again? To increase the rate of profit and so on. But then also, yes, the finances of the foreign banks and industrialists and assistance was indispensable to the rise of German Nazism. But then another thing too is that German Nazism was also almost a kind of startup investment, because the whole thing that had to pay off was the war. So they were financing arms, and all of that had to eventually pay off in the form of the World War. So it was almost like it never got to the point of economic self-sufficiency.
Okay. Yes. Okay. That's true. That is true. I always say that Hitler treated Europeans the way Europeans treated the rest of the world. Essentially, it was at a certain point, it got to the point where if I just need something, I'm going to go out and take it.
Yeah, I mean, you can also interpret Nazism, because it is on topic of Pan-Africanism. Nazism was also a response to this threat, which was epitomized by the Soviet Union, but this general threat of the collapse of the colonial system. The Germans wanted to preserve. They pretended they didn't want to near the end of the war and so on, but in reality, they wanted to. Well, Hitler himself said he wanted to split the world with England. Right? But this threat of this rising of the East in Africa, in the European mind, is also part of the East, because the East just means the other, right? So this threat of this rising of the non-European was a big existential. I'm speaking in a non-materialist way, but just to kind of give some context, right? This existential threat posed by the rising of the non-Western nations was a big existential impetus of Nazism. Nazism saw itself as defending the last stand of the dominance of Europe. And for that reason, that's why Hitler treated, as you said, Europeans like Europeans treated all, because Hitler felt like the only way you could sustain the European dominance was to apply upon itself what it had done to others. um, to rein in and keep control.
Yeah. Well, so I was asking in Mexico, what is really the political landscape looking like there? Um, because as an outsider, really the media, I must say, I've incurred a lot of bias because of what you hear coming out of there is mostly more related to crime and cartels and all that. Um, myself, in that realm of the Afrocentric Pan-African movement, of course, I have studied maybe some of the early period of Mexico, but since that time, since it had its independence, I have not really kept too much up to date. So I wanted to know exactly what that looks like, the political landscape in Mexico, both in terms of philosophy and in terms of what is actually in place.
Well, so let me try to use the best of my abilities of my tongue and language. I am sorry if you don't understand.
I'll try this.
It's very terrible, but well. In Mexico, it's currently in a moment. Recently, it was won the elections by Andrés Manuel López Obrador in a movement that wants to recuperate all let's say the Mexican state for the people. It could be said. It was all the movement that is in Mexico receives the name of the Cuatro T, 4T, the fourth transformation. It's called because in our national mythos, it was three historical transformations: the independence, the reform, that is where the French invasion was defeated by Benito Juarez and all the conservatives, and the intent of restoration of monarchy. The third transformation was the revolution, and in this case, it was created in this moment as the fourth transformation for Mexico, and basically is for AMLO trying to eliminate all this kind of corruption that's common of all the old elites in Mexico. Renationalize a lot of our industries. It's more there's a lot of things that when you talk about what's happened in Africa, that or in general sense of what happens in what is the global south, things that we have in common. Precisely all these ecological organizations in Mexico, they align with the right, because precisely one of the central things for this moment is the renationalization of the oil and the energy and electricity, a kind of renationalization. And obviously, they start to use this ecological question to attack these pretensions of reviving our national oil industry, but in a very opportunistic way. In reality, is trying of at the end of the day, they are in the same line of the international oil industries, or the also private ecological industries that are also foreign. Like if there is a question of a private industry that is Iberdrola here in Mexico, ecological Spanish, and there is a question of trying to recuperate this kind of electricity and generally all the right that is with this is the private industry and has these politicians that with these contracts they declared is that is uh, an an attack in the ecological is the issue in general. One is only to these private industries. Is how this discourse of the ecological is using. For example, Greenpeace has dishonest the issues against the government. All this ecological is to the objective to comply asphyxiate all this reborn of industry. And it's a common issue in a lot of countries in Latin America because at the end of the day, Mexico, it's from Latin America. And you know, it makes me remember a lot of what you say of Pan-Africanism with or issues of Pan-Latino-Americanism, the unity of Latin America. There's this is a common project that is of the lefts here in Latin America, and was with Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales, etc., trying to cultivate this unity. Even if we have a lot of differences between us, we have a common history also of the Spaniard conquest, and also Portugal, etc., and also all the interventions of United States and the English, etc. But we also have a common unity in or distinct difference. We have the indigenous people or the black ancestors that also come here in Latin America. And for one are the parts of the form of what is Latin America. I remember, for example, in Colombia, there is this, los palenquinos are pueblos, towns, townspeoples that is made for black people that escaped and they create his own language, his own pueblos in this. And these common things are these things that from Latin America, trying to unify ourselves in a sense. And this is trying to achieve our own modernity, our own common nation of common sense, or common unity. Or this a very intellectual movement that is trying to, in his own sense, in his own view, trying to create his own modernity from the South, from Latin America. There is an old phrase here in Latin America that is, the South is our North. And it's a common issue how they put the continent of America in verse, and Argentina is up, and the United States and Canada is down, very down. Yeah, this is the common issues. This active movement, political movement of the people here in Mexico and Latin America, and in special Mexico. In Mexico is not only the cartels. Is also this struggle that is coming for the people, and also all the right, and I suppose some kind of pathetic infantile leftists from the West that ultimately they allied with the right, and they continue. I don't know if it's in a general sense of what happened here in Mexico and Latin America in general.
Well, thanks for that, Ray. I think that was actually, you answered all my questions, really. Since Vicente Guerrero, essentially now, if I can just sum up is that there's a new phase that Mexico is entering, where it's kind of like that push for nationalization, and then there is a resistance to that that they are then dealing with. So I think that is a theme, essentially a South American, Central American theme, really, where there is this struggle to nationalize, and then there are forces that are essentially against that. So I think that's. Thank you for answering that question.
I expect I talk sufficiently. But I expect that I understand. I have a lot of issues to try to speak. Well, another thing.
I was fine. I was able to get that. I was able to get most of it.
The idea of a pan Latin American identity interests me.
Bolivarianism, right?
I didn't get that.
It's called Bolivarianism. It was the explicit ideology of the Chavismo. Right. Raul, did you have any other questions besides that one, or?
No, I think it's all been covered.
Because I think you took notes or something, but
yeah, it's all related to what you've talked before.
Oh,
yeah.
So what time is it right now in Burkina Faso?
It's about 1 a.m. in the morning. But to be honest with you, my body clock doesn't work anymore. COVID-19.
Same. I go to bed at 5 a.m., you know?
And yeah. Sometimes I wake up at 3 a.m. and then I'm like, okay. I start my day at 3 a.m. Sometimes it starts at 2, sometimes it starts at 1, sometimes it ends at 3. It's been off. It's all over the place.
So
but yeah, right now it's actually midnight.
So you've been there for 3 years, Burkina Faso?
Yeah. Yes, I have.
So how did you and Evan meet?
We met in Cameroon as a result of the program. I think Evan was one of the volunteers that came into Cameroon. Brave move, I have to say. Cameroon, it's definitely tough, and I'm sure he's let you know some of the struggles there. But it's a tough environment. And as soon as Evan came through, we sparked conversation, and then quickly found out that he was also intellectual and involved politically, which was great. So we found the relationship on that. But also, he was working alongside with me in that company, Ace Foundation.
Yeah. I mean, Evan came back from Cameroon. I'm sure with a really new perspective, right? Like you were telling me about how you viewed what is the fucking place called? I forgot the fucking city.
Oh, Grand Rapids?
Grand Rapids, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's completely different. Yeah, as Sammy said, Cameroon is not an easy place to get along, so you go anywhere else and you're completely different. You got to figure out, okay, how do I? Grand Rapids is kind of a soft place in comparison to Cameroon, which is so you gotta learn you gotta soften back up when you. I had to soften back up when I came back home.
You become like Rambo,
Yeah.
Yeah. So wait, you're from America though, right? You're from Texas.
Yes.
And were your parents immigrants or?
No, my mother is an American, foundational American. She was born in the U.S., raised in the U.S. My father is from Cameroon.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
My father came over to the U.S. in the 80s and then met my mother.
That's interesting. It's really interesting. And you found your way back, not quite to Cameroon right now, but found your way back to the other... Yeah.
Yes, well, essentially, with me, I kind of grew up. I was born here, stayed here for a bit, and I grew up in Cameroon, and then between there and South Africa, and now here in Burkina Faso.
Yeah, you're what they call a true internationalist,
Yeah, well, yeah. In a sense, in a certain sense. But I realize there's a thing that comes with that where you're not really able to. Patriotism is funny to me.
Yeah.
It's funny. It's just funny, just the thought of it. But yeah, I guess you would say that's it. So,
So,
but I would.
yeah. Sorry, go on.
No. I just had just a small question I was going to ask.
Yeah.
I'm sorry because I've been exposed to all this other crowds, so I also wanted to see what Romania's situation is. But I think you could go to a question that maybe wants to answer. He can answer. Sorry, Raul was your name?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
So, do you want anything more specific, or do you want Romania's situation like in European geopolitics?
European geopolitics.
Okay, so we have a quite large migrant population. So most of our worker population is most likely working somewhere else in the European Union. So it's Germany or Italy or most likely Spain. And they go back and forth. They bring back some money, and yeah, this is rooted in the crumbling industry, which has been neglected since the fall of communism here. So most of the politicians here seem corrupt, and the people have no reason to trust them. So they're basically in a deadlock where they go to other European countries to work, or they just sit here and rot, basically. That's pretty much in the rural side of the country. The rural, and it's also an aging country. Our young people are not really there.
Well, yeah, that's a general European problem, is what I see. Aging.
It is, but this dynamic of migration is mostly from the southern and eastern European countries toward the most central ones, like Germany. I think Germany is the best example.
Do you foresee any political undercurrent or any movement within Romania that is gathering momentum?
I think it's quite funny because out of all the European countries I've actually looked at, ours is mostly aligned with the US. So we're bootlicking NATO, we're bootlicking the US, we're hating everything else. We're even hating the more liberal currents from the European Union. It's quite funny. We don't even have the liberal tradition. We've never had. We try to like between the wars to have some, but then we've quickly changed to fascism. So it didn't last long, and yeah, it's a deadlock.
As they say, I'm sure Tigger has an optimistic view on it.
I do, yeah. I've actually explicitly talked about it with Raul in particular. I have a concept I call polar communism. And the idea is to mobilize these rotting pensioners he's talking about in the countryside and the old communist crumbling infrastructure to relate to this site with a new 21st century interface, smartphones, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Basically to unite these two. Like basically the basic idea is that communism didn't really collapse. It still has these leftovers, and that this should be reactivated with a new impulse and impetus and reinvigoration is what I like to put it, from the urban centers. So yes, my view is optimistic.
Yeah, sorry if it came off as too pessimistic. It's because some of our more liberal intellectuals, so they align themselves with the European Union, and they'd be completely opposed to what Tahir mentioned.
Yeah,
So
like my idea is that in these ex-communist countries, liberalism is just a kind of vanity. The majority of the people are still immersed in this leftover of the communist legacy, and that legacy needs to be returned to. Liberalism is a fake, failed experiment, pretty much. You know, what they say
yeah,
about
exactly.
communism is what applies to contemporary liberalism. You know.
Essentially, essentially. No, but Raul, don't feel bad. It's we have a balance. We have a balance here. You gotta have the guys like the heroes. You guys have the guys like us.
Yeah.
And because I'm a pure skeptic myself too, man. I see good things and I can't even enjoy them because my brain just automatically starts to break down how it could possibly be. But yeah, it's we need that balance. So that's
Yeah.
okay.
I'm actually curious. Did Romania fund with arms and so on during the Cold War the African liberation movements itself? 'Cause I know it was estranged from the Soviet bloc at a certain point and aligned actually more with the U.S. I think in the
Yeah, I'm
70s.
honestly not sure about it. About this, we've had some really weird alliances in the Cold War, like alliance with Chile, with Pinochet's Chile.
Yeah.
That was that was weird. I'm not sure.
Yeah, because Romania
And
is known for its arms, you know? Maybe
yeah,
that's because of the collapse.
and we've also played pretty opportunistically with the US. So we've also been opposed. We've had a love-hate relationship with the USSR, and we've tried to play it friendly to the West. So we may have funded some shitty movements here and there.
Yeah.
But that was before '89. After that, we've completely gone NATO and Westernized.
Exactly. I would think that would be when it was more part of the USSR, within that, very much within that sphere of influence, that they may have inadvertently contributed any kind of donations by it. Even Sheikh Anta Diop himself had to get money from socialists to be able to finance his research, which would explain some of his political affiliations. But yeah, I think I've always that relation between Africa and particularly Russia really fascinating. You think of the Battle of Adwa in Ethiopia during the colonial era, and how they were able to thwart the Italian invasion, even though we were able to thwart the Italian invasion essentially with help from a Swiss diplomat that worked with the King Menelik and a supposed link with Russia because they were both Orthodox Christians. I refuse to believe that that's the only reason, but then that's the skeptic in me. I believe that there's another reason, perhaps, but I cannot find evidence for any economic interest that Russia would have in Ethiopia.
Well,
but then when I see of their resurgence during the Derg, after when the Haile Selassie was ousted, how it was immediately replaced by a communist regime. Maybe there was an underlying current, but needless to say, Russia has been there for Africa even before communism. During that era, communism wasn't really much of a thought, but it was during that time, during the Battle of Adwa, that Russians helped out Ethiopians with artillery shells as well as instructors, military instructors that were able to train the militia. And I've just always been fascinated with that link. Why that affinity? Is it really just the fact that they're Orthodox Christians, or is there something else?
The way I've interpreted it is that you also have in Russia fascinating cases like Pushkin, right? The famous literary author who was of African descent, and the person he was descended from became a really prominent figure in the aristocracy, established an independent family. I think the reason is that Russia had an alternative response to modernity than England had, these two poles. And Russia found itself more having solidarity with African nations because they also were freshly exposed to this modernity. And Russia did not have. Russia had a competing vision of the universal humanity even before communism, opposed to the English kind. And in this vision of the universal humanity, there's no room for not just racism, but also the specific idea of humanity that maybe originated somewhere in Europe after the Protestant Reformation, which attributed certain qualities to humanity, and then if people don't have these qualities, they're not human, right? This kind of modernistic view of humanity. The Russian vision of humanity almost, I would really be, there's no way I could sum it up without butchering it, but the way I would put it is that it views the wealth of the particularity of humanity as the concrete manifestation and realization of the universal. It doesn't view the particular as opposed to the universal like the English did. So I think this implicit solidarity of Russia with the African nations specifically reflected that. I think it reflected the fact that they didn't have this kind of a priori racism toward the African peoples, and because of this, some kind of fresh encounter of two very different peoples and nations and so on, was able to be established.
Well, that would explain life, especially in terms of worldview. When you put it that way, you say that they have a connected worldview as opposed to a distinct or being able to separate things that makes things more as a customer, as a group. I think that would be very much.
Yeah, Russia, the very idea of Russia has always been a multi-ethnic and even multi-religious civilization. It's never been a simple one nation state, you know. Like England, for example, what they call the United Kingdom was an island, you know. So it defined itself first against the whole of Europe. But Russia was, from the very beginning, this is a really huge other conversation, but followed from the Mongol invasion, this kind of view of polity and statehood is something that is beyond one privileged group, something that is I like to call it determinate universality. Not an empty, abstract universality that is imposed upon the world, but a determinate, specific form of universal humanity.
Well, so thank you, Raul, for shedding light on that, on that perspective.
I think, as far as my notes are concerned that I saved, I think we actually covered everything. Or am I missing something? Or?
No, I think we touched on everything.
Yeah, but this was a really fruitful discussion. I mean, really,
yeah, that was actually really interesting what you said.
Yeah, I'm really grateful and really glad to have had you on. It was like I knew.
Guys,
sorry.
I really it was interesting discussion. It went a lot of directions, but I think we kept coming back on certain central points, and it was really great.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad that Evan had the experience in the first place, to have come into contact with you, you know, so that we could present this. It's really rare, is what I'm trying to say. Like, to have perspectives like yours, and also Evan's, because Evan lived in Cameroon for a while, be given in this kind of light.